Hello everyone, and wishing you all a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story that will send chills down your spine. A man discovers that the footsteps haunting him his entire life were never ghosts. They were his own father, watching from the shadows since he was just 7 years old. What kind of father stalks his own child for decades? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what happens next. Outside the small wooden house, the wind carried the distant echo of church bells ringing through the valley. It was Christmas Eve, a night meant for warmth, for family, for whispered prayers of gratitude. Candles flickered on the modest table, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Diep had decorated a small pine branch with strips of colored cloth and a few glass beads, her attempt to bring some festivity into their humble home. But tonight, the air inside felt heavier than the winter cold outside. Tonight, secrets that had been buried for decades were about to claw their way to the surface. James sat on the old wooden chair, a blanket draped across his lap. His body still bore the marks of his ordeal, the fever that had nearly claimed him, the hunger that had hollowed his cheeks, the exhaustion of being hunted through forests so dark that even the moon seemed afraid to enter. He had survived all of that, yet the fear that gripped him now was something far older, something he had carried since he was barely tall enough to reach his mother's hand. Diep sat across from him, her pregnant belly a gentle curve beneath her wool sweater. Her eyes hadn't left his face since he'd begun speaking. Beside them, Officer Ly stood with his arms crossed, his usual composure replaced by an unusual stillness. "My father," James said, his voice barely above a whisper, "followed my mother too." The words hung in the air like frost on a window pane. Diep pressed her fingertips to her lips, her heartbeat thundering so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The bamboo grove outside swayed in the wind, but inside the house, nothing dared to move. "James," Diep finally exhaled, her voice thin and trembling, "your father followed your mother." James swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. He watched her. Every time she stepped outside the house, every time she went to visit a neighbor, every time she walked me to school. He closed his eyes as if the memory itself was burning him from within. Diep leaned forward, desperation creeping into her voice. "But why?" James murmured. "There didn't need to be a reason. Control was enough." A cold shiver slid down her spine. Outside, their dog Dawn barked once, not loudly, but sharp and sudden, as if reacting to the tension bleeding through the walls. James continued, his voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. "When I was 9, my mother left home for a few weeks. No one told me the truth. They said she needed to visit a relative." He paused, gathering the fragments of a memory he had tried so hard to bury. "But one night, I overheard my father arguing with one of his men." Diep's breath hitched. She could feel the dread forming in her chest, thick and suffocating. "He was furious," James whispered. "He said she dared to disobey, that she forgot her place. He sent someone to bring her back." Tears glistened in Diep's eyes. Did they hurt her? James shook his head, though pain flickered across his features like lightning in a distant storm. "No, but when she came back, she wasn't the same person. She didn't talk much. She didn't smile the way she used to. She moved like someone who was always listening for footsteps behind her." A tear rolled down Diep's cheek, catching the candlelight before disappearing into the darkness. "And I didn't understand," James said, "not until years later, not until I realized how far my father was willing to go just to keep someone under his control." Ly stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "James, is that why your mother left for good?" James nodded slowly. When I turned 16, she found the courage to run again, farther, smarter. She never came back that time. My father gave up searching after 6 months. Lee exchanged a quiet look with Diep, both of them realizing the same chilling truth at the same moment. "So, when you left home," Diep whispered, "he started doing the same thing to you?" James's hands clenched around the blanket. "Yes, and when I met you, when we grew close, he assumed you were the reason I was rebelling." His eyes met hers, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. "You became the target." Diep pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart crack beneath her palm. "James, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought distancing myself from him would protect you," he said. "But when the shadow appeared outside our house this morning, I knew he hadn't stopped, not after all these years." Diep's voice trembled like a leaf in a storm. "The person watching us, you think it was someone he sent?" "I don't know," James whispered, "but it fits. The timing, the letter, the questions Lee found at the border. My father's obsession with control hasn't faded." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "And now that we're married," Diep continued for him, her hand moving instinctively to her belly, "with a baby on the way?" Silence filled the room, heavy as stone. Lee cleared his throat and crouched beside the small wooden table. He spread out the warning letter, a few notes he had taken earlier, and a rough map of the area. "Before we assume the worst," he said, "let's piece together everything we know." He tapped the letter. "First, someone warned you. Second, someone watched the house this morning. Third, someone close to James's father has been asking for your information for weeks." He sat back, his expression grave. "All three point to a controlled, organized effort, someone with resources, someone who knows exactly where to look." Diep closed her eyes. The picture was becoming terrifyingly clear. "But there's something that doesn't add up," Lee continued. James looked up. "What is it?" "The warning letter," Lee said. "If your father sent someone to track you, why would someone else warn Diep? Someone is working against him." Diep blinked. "Someone against Transon?" Lee nodded thoughtfully. "It could be a former employee, a driver, a security guard, someone who saw too much." James whispered, his voice hollow. "Or someone who knew what he did to my mother." A chill crawled down Diep's spine. This wasn't just about James anymore. This wasn't just about the shadow outside their house. This was something deeper, something that had taken root years before she ever knew he existed. James leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "There's another reason I didn't want to believe my father was involved." Diep waited, her breath caught in her throat. "When I was walking home, limping through the forest, I felt like someone was behind me, not close, but far enough to stay hidden." Diep's heart dropped. "James, why didn't you tell Lee earlier?" "Because I thought I was imagining it," he said. "But after hearing Dawn bark this morning, after seeing that letter, I'm not so sure anymore." "Describe it," Lee said, straightening. James closed his eyes, summoning the memory. "It felt like footsteps, slow, careful, always stopping when I stopped." Diep's breath caught painfully. "And one night," James continued, "I found boot prints near the spot where I slept. Not mine, not the farm family's." "What kind of boots?" Lee asked. "Expensive ones," James said. "The kind my father's men used to wear." Diep's hand flew to her mouth. "James," she whispered, her voice cracking, "are you saying your father has been following you since the day you disappeared?" James didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Diep felt tears rising again, but this time they weren't born from fear alone. They came from heartbreak, for James, for the boy he used to be, for the man who had been forced to run from his own blood. "My father," James finally whispered, "doesn't let go of anything he thinks he owns." He turned slightly, meeting Deep's trembling gaze. "And Deep, he believes he owns me." The candle on the table flickered violently, as if the flame itself was disturbed by his words. Somewhere in the distance, the church bells rang again, 12 chimes, marking the arrival of Christmas midnight. "James," Deep whispered, her voice barely a breath, "what exactly did your father do when you were a child?" James hesitated. Then, with his eyes locked on hers, he spoke the words that would change everything. "When I was little, he didn't just follow my mother, he followed me too." The confession hung in the air like dust caught in a shaft of candlelight, unmoving, impossible to ignore. Deep didn't blink. She couldn't. The man she loved was sitting right in front of her, but suddenly she could see a boy behind his eyes, small, frightened, running through shadows much darker than the ones outside their house. "When I was 7, James began, "I used to sneak out into the garden at night just to look at the stars. It was the only time the house felt quiet." He paused, staring at his hands. "One night, I felt someone behind me, not close, not touching me, but watching." He took a shaky breath. "I turned around, no one was there, but the next morning my father told me exactly how long I sat on the stone steps, what I whispered, which star I pointed at." Deep's heart tightened painfully. "He didn't scold me that time," James continued. "He just smiled and told me he would always know where I was." Ly's jaw clenched. "That's surveillance, not parenting." James nodded slowly. That was only the beginning. He recounted the years like pages torn from a diary he had tried to burn. At 9, he tried to play with village children. His father listed every detail of his afternoon the next day, though he had never been there. At 12, he joined a math club in secret, only for his father's man to be waiting at the gate 3 weeks later. That night, his father lectured him for 2 hours about loyalty, obedience, and the sacred rule that nothing in James's life should happen without permission. At 16, he tried to take a bus to visit a friend. His father found him before midnight. "No matter where you go, I will always bring you back." Deep shook her head slowly, horrified. "That's not protection, that's imprisonment." James finally looked at her, his eyes red but dry. "My father never followed people out of love. He followed them out of ownership." Ly placed a steady hand on James's shoulder. "If you want to protect your family, you need to tell me everything, every detail from your childhood, everything your father did, everything you remember about his methods." James stiffened. Deep looked at him anxiously. "Can you do that?" she whispered. James looked at her, and in his eyes she could almost see the boy hiding behind the grown man, a boy who had learned far too early what fear felt like. Slowly, painfully, James nodded. Ly sat down across from him, taking out a small notebook. "Start with the first memory you can't forget." James inhaled deeply, closed his eyes, and whispered, "When I was little, I used to think the footsteps behind me were ghosts." He opened his eyes, hollow, distant. But they were never ghosts. It was always him. His voice cracked as he spoke the final line. "My father has been doing this to me since I was very, very young." The candles burned lower. Outside, the wind had grown quiet, as if even nature was holding its breath. Deep reached across the table and took James's hand in both of hers. Her tears had dried, replaced by something stronger, a fierce, quiet determination. "He won't take you," she said. "He won't take us." James looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. "We're not alone anymore," she continued. "Whatever he sends, whoever comes, we face it together." Ly nodded, tucking his notebook away. "We prepare," We watch, and when the time comes, we'll be ready." James squeezed Deep's hand, and for the first time that night, something that might have been hope flickered in his eyes. Outside, the first light of Christmas morning began to touch the horizon. The shadows remained, but so did they, together, unbroken and no longer running. The past had come to find them, but this time they would not flee. On a quiet Christmas Eve, James finally reveals the dark truth he has carried since childhood. What Deep believed were strangers watching their home turns out to be something far more sinister. Echoes of a father whose obsession with control began decades ago. James confesses that his father, Tran Son, didn't just follow his mother's every move, he tracked James too, since the age of 7. From counting the stars James pointed at to intercepting his friendships and secret activities, nothing escaped his father's surveillance. When his mother tried to escape, she returned broken. When James himself fled, the shadow followed him through forests and across borders. Now, with Deep pregnant and their small family vulnerable, the past has finally caught up. But Officer Lee discovers something unexpected. Someone close to Tran Son is secretly working against him, and maybe their only hope.